From the moment I unfolded that bright orange envelope, a chill ran down my spine. The paper crinkled in my hands as I read the printed words over and over, each line a hammer striking against my sense of safety and logic. The letter claimed that I had constructed an unapproved water retention structure and warned of fines, legal actions, and mandatory removal if I didn't comply immediately. My eyes darted across the room, searching for some kind of joke, a hint that this was all a misunderstanding. But the words remained rigid, unyielding. In the dim hallway light, the shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting around the edges of the letter, making the typeface seem almost alive, aggressive. I could feel my heart rate accelerate as a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. This was my home, my sanctuary, the place I had worked tirelessly to maintain, to nurture. And now, suddenly, it had become the center of a storm I couldn't yet comprehend. Behind me, in the blurred background, Linda Crowford's figure remained poised, almost statuesque. Her silver blonde hair was pinned neatly in a bun, her black blazer pressed and precise, her gaze sharp and calculating even from a distance. It felt as if her eyes could pierce straight through me, reading every thought, every doubt, every moment of hesitation. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. There was no warmth, no empathy, just cold authority, and the kind of quiet judgment that makes your skin crawl. I tried to steady my shaking hands, gripping the edges of the letter as if holding on to it would somehow give me control. But control was slipping, dissolving into disbelief. The dam I had built, painstakingly and responsibly, was nothing more than a threat in their eyes, a violation waiting to be punished. I remembered the neighbors' smiles when I had first finished it, the quiet pride as the water pooled and slowed, harmlessly redirecting itself. And now, it was all being condemned. The words, compliance required and 10-day deadline jumped out at me, sinking into my mind like icy water. My throat tightened. This wasn't just a letter. It was an intrusion, a warning, and a prelude to a battle I hadn't asked for. My thoughts raced. How could a simple natural structure be considered dangerous? How could they not see that it had saved properties, prevented flooding, and even won the gratitude of my neighbors? Yet here it was, the embodiment of authority wielded with no sense of logic, no regard for the reality of the land, the water, or the safety it provided. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as I realized the fight was starting, and I was already in the arena, letter in hand, facing an opponent who didn't understand, or perhaps didn't care about the truth. Every instinct in me screamed to respond, to defend, to explain, to negotiate. But even as I took a deep breath, a creeping doubt lingered. Would words and reason stand? A chance against the rigid. The morning air was crisp and unusually still, a quiet hush that blanketed the neighborhood like a soft, protective veil. Streets stretched empty, the sun barely peeking over the distant tree line, painting the houses in golden hues that promised peace and serenity. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, the steam curling up in delicate spirals, and for a brief moment, the troubles of the world felt distant, almost unreal. My shoes crunched lightly on the gravel as I walked past rows of meticulously maintained lawns, each blade of grass standing in perfect formation, a silent testament to the community's obsession with order and appearance. I paused at the corner, gazing toward the slope behind my house. The gentle patch of forest that edged my property cast long shadows across the yards below. The tranquility of this place had been the very reason I moved here. The promise of quiet streets, the reassurance of safety, the simple pleasure of living in harmony with neighbors who respected both property and privacy. Yet as I sipped my coffee and took in the morning calm, a small unease whispered at the edges of my mind. There had been no sign, no hint, nothing at all to suggest that this serenity was fragile, that beneath the polished exterior of trimmed hedges and clean sidewalks, the rigid rules of the HOA waited silently, ready to make a presence known in the most disruptive way possible. The thought felt almost absurd. How could a community so seemingly perfect harbor the kind of cold, controlling bureaucracy that might threaten a simple act of responsibility? My eyes drifted to my own property, the dam I had built, nestled subtly against the slope. Its purpose was simple, protecting the homes below from seasonal floods, but in the quiet light of dawn, it seemed almost like a hidden weapon, waiting silently to reveal its significance. I continued my walk, unaware that the same streets that now appeared peaceful were on the verge of being transformed into a battleground. The neighbors' greetings were polite but distant. Behind every smile could have been a flicker of concern, a sense that someone, somewhere, would soon challenge the delicate balance we all assumed existed. For now, I relished the morning, the calm, the illusion of safety. I could not have known that this very quiet, this very perfection, was only the surface layer. Beneath it lay a tension waiting to erupt, rules waiting to be enforced, and a confrontation that would test not only my resolve, but the very definition of responsibility and common sense in our tightly controlled community. And as the sunlight stretched across the neatly aligned roofs, I sensed unknowingly that the storm, figurative and literal, was approaching, and the harmony of our lives would soon be shattered by decisions made far from logic and far from empathy. In the quiet of my backyard, I knelt beside the dam I had painstakingly built, stones and packed earth forming, a modest yet effective barrier that stretched across the slope behind my house. Each stone, carefully selected for size and shape, fitted precisely into the mosaic I had created, while the soil between them had been reinforced to ensure stability under the pressure of seasonal storms. I ran my hands along the surface, feeling the cool dampness where recent rains had left traces, and took a deep breath. This dam was more than a practical construction. It was a manifestation of responsibility, of foresight, a shield protecting the homes below from the fury of unrelenting water flow. As I examined the runoff channel, watching the small stream trickle through its carefully carved path, a sense of pride settled over me. I had spent weeks learning about drainage, soil displacement, and water pressure, consulting with landscapers and reading technical guides, all to ensure that my creation would function perfectly. The community below had faced minor flooding over the years, and it had always been frustrating to witness their yards turn swampy after storms. Now, thanks to this barrier, those days seemed to be coming to an end. But even in this moment of accomplishment, an unease lingered in my chest. The HOA's influence was subtle but pervasive, a constant shadow over our community. I knew that any alteration to property, even one as benign and well-intentioned as this, could attract scrutiny. The thought of letters, complaints, or fines loomed at the edge of my mind, but I tried to push it away. I had acted responsibly, acted ethically, and acted solely to prevent harm. That should have been enough. Still, I couldn't ignore the quiet sense of tension in the air, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to disrupt the balance. The houses below, framed by their well-manicured lawns, looked peaceful, unaware that a single decision from the HOA could undo everything. And as I stood to survey the dam from a higher vantage point, the full slope unfolding before me, I felt the weight of potential consequences pressing gently on my shoulders. This small, unassuming structure was about to become the center of a storm that had little to do with nature and everything to do with bureaucracy, pride, and stubborn adherence to rules devoid of reason. The quiet moment of satisfaction would soon give way to tension, conflict, and a struggle I had not anticipated, but which would define not just my property, but the harmony of an entire community. The stillness of the morning broke with the crunch of gravel, beneath deliberate footsteps. From the end of the driveway, I saw Linda Crowford approaching, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, black blazer sharp against the soft light of sunrise. Behind her, two other HOA members trailed, clipboards in hand, their faces unreadable but carrying the unmistakable air of authority. My stomach tightened, an immediate surge of apprehension reminding me that this was not a casual visit. They were the enforcers of the rules I had tried to ignore, the representatives of a system that measured compliance above logic. And here they were, standing on my property. I straightened instinctively, hands tensing at my sides, aware that any gesture could be scrutinized, any word misinterpreted. Linda's eyes, cool and assessing, locked onto my small dam. The subtle curve of the stones, the precise channeling of runoff, everything I had worked on so meticulously was under their gaze. She stopped a few steps from the edge of my yard, clipboard poised, lips pressed together. The other two members fidgeted slightly, glancing at each other before returning attention to my property, flipping pages on their forms as though checking a script, for the confrontation that was about to unfold. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but a flicker of defensiveness escaped. This was my land, my responsibility, and yet, in an instant, it felt like I was being accused of a crime I hadn't committed. The community had never asked for this barrier. I had built it voluntarily to protect homes from flooding. But in the rigid eyes of the HOA, intent mattered little. Structure, authority, and adherence to their process was paramount. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison," Linda said, voice even but firm, carrying across the quiet morning. The words should have felt polite, but they rang with control. "We're here to inspect an unapproved structure affecting drainage on your property." My jaw tightened. Inspect? I had anticipated their letters, their meetings, perhaps even verbal warnings, but here they were in person, crossing the invisible line between concern and intrusion. I met her gaze steadily, refusing to shrink back, while simultaneously feeling the uneasy tension rising in my chest. The peaceful morning, the serenity of my carefully maintained garden, the faint scent of dew, all of it now seemed to teeter on the edge of confrontation. This visit was more than a check. It was the opening salvo in a conflict I had not sought but could no longer avoid. Every step they took forward made the space feel smaller, the stakes higher. The small dam behind me, once a quiet testament to responsibility and foresight, now seemed like a lightning rod, drawing scrutiny and challenging the authority of those who believed rules superseded reason. And as they stopped, standing in a neat line across from me, I realized with a sinking certainty the moment had arrived. Standing face to face with Linda, the weight of bureaucracy pressing down on me, I felt an almost physical tension in the air. She held the clipboard like a weapon, the document emblazoned with bold letters, accusing me of an unauthorized structure. I met her gaze evenly, refusing to shrink away, but my mind raced, recalling every stone, every inch of soil I had placed by hand. Every choice had been deliberate. Every action meant to protect, not provoke. Linda's finger jabbed at the paper, each movement precise and controlled, like a metronome measuring the gravity of my supposed offense. "Mr. Ellison, this is not permitted," she said, voice tight but controlled. The words should have been simple, even mundane, but delivered with such conviction they felt like a sentence handed down without trial. Around us, the neighborhood seemed oblivious, but I could feel the judgment in their invisible eyes, in the whisper of leaves and the distant barking of dogs. I tried to explain, to convey the logic and responsibility behind the dam. "This barrier is contained entirely on my property. Its natural materials harmless. It protects the homes downhill." Her expression didn't change. A perfect mask of authority, as if my explanation was a minor irritation rather than a critical point. I continued, urgency rising in my chest. "If you remove it, you risk exactly what we've been trying to prevent." But words alone weren't enough. Her hand lifted, gesturing dismissively. "The architectural committee will determine its fate," she said, cold and precise. The declaration hung in the air, final and immovable. My jaw tightened. I could feel frustration rising. The incredulity of being ordered to dismantle months of careful work for nothing, more than adherence to rules. As I glanced toward the dam behind me, the small, sturdy structure that had kept water at bay, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. Every storm I had prepared for, every precaution taken, now risked being undone by people who refused to understand its purpose. My neighbors' future and the integrity of their properties rested on decisions being made by those who valued formality over function and reason over common sense. In that first confrontation, I realized the fight wasn't just about me or my backyard. It was about standing against the rigidity of a system that prioritized procedure over protection, and the storm that would soon follow had only begun to gather on the horizon. Days passed and the letters kept arriving, stacking higher and higher across the surface of my kitchen table. Each envelope brought a new level of disbelief, a fresh wave of bureaucratic aggression. $50, $100, $250, fines escalating not because of negligence or danger, but because of a principle, a rigid enforcement of rules that ignored logic and community safety. I ran my fingers along the edges of the papers, each one crisp, official, threatening, their cold ink a sharp contrast to the warmth of my home. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the absurdity of it all. How could the very action that prevented harm now be penalized? The dam had functioned perfectly, slowing water, preventing flooding, protecting homes below my slope. Yet here I was, treated as a reckless rogue, a disruptor of order, a threat where there had never been one. My mind replayed conversations with neighbors who thanked me, expressed relief, even joked about the potential savings. And yet these voices of reason seemed powerless against the formal weight of the HOA's edicts. As I sifted through each notice, I felt frustration mounting. The fines weren't just financial. They were a psychological tactic, a means to wear me down, to instill compliance through intimidation. The language in the letters grew harsher, the typeface larger, the warnings more ominous. Each one demanded attention, submission, acknowledgement of wrongdoing for actions that had only ever aimed to safeguard the community. I considered my options, though choices felt limited. Appeal? Acknowledge fault for the sake of peace? Or resist, knowing that logic and integrity were on my side? Every letter demanded compliance, every notice an act of control, and the cumulative weight threatened to crush not only my resolve, but the very principle that had guided me to act responsibly in the first place. Through the window, sunlight flickered across the room, illuminating the stacks of letters like a battlefield spread before me. I breathed deeply, attempting calm, and reminded myself why I had built the barrier. For safety, for neighbors, for common sense. And even as the cold authority of the HOA sought to intimidate, I realized that the upcoming storm, literal and figurative, would test not just structures, but principles, character, and courage. The board meeting was one of those suffocatingly tense affairs, where silence was more oppressive than noise. I entered the room, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some plainly hostile. Linda, as always, stood at the head of the table, posture rigid, expression unyielding. Charts, graphs, and images of my backyard barrier were projected on the screen, each labeled in bold with warnings and cautionary notes. My neighbors sat beside me, some supportive, some anxious, all waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. The discussion began with a formal reading of the violation notice, a litany of words that, despite their professional veneer, reeked of intimidation. Every phrase was measured, each sentence carefully chosen to paint my actions as reckless, unlawful, and endangering. Linda spoke with authority, her voice echoing off the polished walls, commanding the attention of everyone present. She emphasized liability, the sanctity of HOA rules, and the potential threat posed by my modest barrier. Each claim felt exaggerated, twisted almost beyond recognition, but the room nodded as if reality had been bent to align with her narrative. I listened patiently, letting the absurdity roll over me like waves. I could feel my frustration bubbling, yet I restrained myself, knowing that words spoken in anger here could become ammunition for them. The neighbors murmured amongst themselves, some whispering agreements, others skeptical glances. I caught eyes with a few who had previously thanked me, their silent support both comforting and galvanizing. Finally, it was my turn. I spoke calmly, deliberately, recounting the rationale behind the dam, the environmental safety measures, and the real, observed consequences of previous flooding. I highlighted the very homes that had benefited, the yards that had stayed dry, the protection afforded to property that was now being jeopardized by administrative arrogance. Linda interrupted multiple times, her interjections sharp and condescending. Yet I pressed on, confident in the correctness of my position. I could feel the tension in the room spike, the board members shifting uncomfortably, their authority challenged not by rebellion, but by logic and evidence. By the end of the session, while no official decision had been made, the atmosphere had shifted. People were beginning to see not only the injustice of the fines and threats, but the real, tangible consequences that would inevitably follow if my voice was ignored. I left the meeting with a heavy heart, yet a quiet resolve. The storm was coming, and not just in the sky. This meeting had only intensified the sense that my responsibility went beyond compliance. With a rigid, arbitrary system, it was about ensuring that logic and safety were not sacrificed on the altar of bureaucracy. The morning air was thick with anticipation, and not the kind that brought excitement or relief. Instead, there was a heaviness that seemed to press against the chest, a foreboding sense that the day would unfold exactly as I had feared. Outside, the demolition crew assembled, yellow vests glinting against the dull gray of the sky. Their machinery loomed large, mechanical claws and shovels waiting like predators. I approached cautiously, hands raised not in surrender but in protest, voice steady but firm as I called out to them. Linda stood behind, arms crossed, expression an unyielding mixture of authority and vindication. She surveyed the scene with the kind of satisfaction reserved for someone confident in the righteousness of their bureaucracy. "This is authorized," she announced, each word a dagger in the fragile hope I had maintained. I reminded them, explaining the purpose of the structure, the precise measurements, the careful planning, and the tangible protection it provided. My words were precise, weighted, meant to convey urgency and reason. The crew glanced at each other, uncertain but bound by orders. Each piece of equipment was a symbol of the bureaucracy's power, a physical manifestation of their unwillingness to see the nuance behind the rules. I felt a surge of frustration, realizing that logic alone was no match for legal authority and formal mandates. I tried again to appeal to sense, to responsibility, but the words fell into a void that echoed with indifference. As the first sledgehammer swung, I flinched. Stone met stone, earth displaced in a series of metallic thuds and crashes. I watched helplessly as hours of careful labor, designed to safeguard, protect, and nurture, were dismantled with clinical precision. The air was charged, every movement amplified by the tension in the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered, sensing the injustice unfolding. The destruction was methodical, relentless. I cataloged each moment in my mind, a mental ledger of the hours, sweat, and care that had gone into a project now rendered meaningless. Linda's satisfaction, juxtaposed with my helplessness, was a cruel tableau of what happens when authority prioritizes form over function, rules over reason, and procedure over protection. In the midst of the chaos, I felt a quiet resolve solidifying within me. This was not the end, not by any measure. The storm had been postponed, delayed perhaps, but its inevitability loomed closer with each displaced stone, each collapsing wall of earth. The battle had shifted, escalating into something beyond fines or threats, a confrontation between prudence and bureaucracy, between protection and pride. And in that realization, a new clarity emerged. I would not let the consequences of this demolition go unchallenged. As the first hammer struck the dam, a sharp, metallic crack echoed through the yard, immediately followed by a cascade of stones tumbling into the shallow channel below. Each thud reverberated like a drumbeat of frustration and helplessness. The labor of weeks reduced to rubble in mere moments. My heart pounded not from fear of injury, but from the disbelief that human decisions could so recklessly destroy something essential. The stones, painstakingly arranged to redirect the water safely, now lay scattered, and the earth that had been molded, with care, crumbled beneath the crew's relentless swings. Linda's presence loomed like a shadow, her posture unyielding, arms crossed, face composed but resolute. She seemed detached from the real-world consequences, focused solely on the symbolic victory of enforcing rules she valued more than safety. I called out, attempting one final plea, explaining how the structure had functioned perfectly, how it prevented flooding, how removing it would unleash chaos. But my words, carried by the wind, fell on ears deafened by bureaucracy and pride. The crew worked efficiently, methodically, each strike of the sledgehammer displacing another section of earth, each stone that rolled down the slope a painful reminder of my inability to intervene. I tried to intervene physically, but the authority of Linda and her paperwork rendered my protests meaningless. My neighbors watched, their faces a mixture of sympathy, frustration, and helplessness, understanding that this wasn't just a clash over property, it was a collision between common sense and rigid control. As the last section of the dam collapsed, a sudden realization hit me. The very thing keeping the community safe was gone. The water that had been managed, controlled, and harmlessly guided now had no restraint. I felt a chill, not from the storm clouds forming above, but from the impending consequences that would follow. Nature would obey physics, not HOA rules, and soon every home below me would experience what I had tried to prevent. Time seemed to stretch as I surveyed the destruction. Every stone scattered, every trench breached, every channel obliterated represented a future problem. The storm was coming, inevitable and merciless, And the consequences of this administrative decision would not be abstract. They would be immediate, visible, and devastating. My helplessness fueled a quiet determination. This wasn't just my fight, it was a fight for truth, safety, and accountability, and I vowed that the lesson being learned would not be forgotten. The first rain of the season arrived in sheets, pounding the exposed hillside with relentless force. The small trenches that once guided water were overwhelmed instantly, soil turning to slurry, debris picking up speed as it surged downhill. From my vantage point, the destruction was terrifyingly clear. The careful order I had established with my dam was gone, and in its absence, the water behaved with unbridled fury. I ran toward the lower homes, adrenaline sharpening my senses, the sound of rushing water a constant roar in my ears. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, expressions ranging from confusion to panic. Garden fences began to bow under pressure. Small decorative features were ripped loose, and the once tidy yards quickly transformed into channels of mud and water. I shouted warnings, signaling to anyone who would listen, attempting to organize a last-minute defense, though I knew logically it would be insufficient. Every step I took, the ground beneath me seemed less stable, soaked and treacherous, and yet there was no time to hesitate. The water raced with a velocity that betrayed its simple origins. The slope acted as a funnel, concentrating the energy of the storm into a destructive force aimed directly at the homes below. I could see the beginnings of pooling in the first yard, where a small garden shed tilted alarmingly, threatening to collapse. Panic was spreading, neighbors yelling instructions to one another, trying to make sandbags or dig makeshift channels. But the torrent was merciless. I spotted Daniel, one of the neighbors I had helped before, trying to protect his daughter as the water approached the patio. Instinct overrode all else. I sprinted, arms outstretched, shouting for them to follow. The fear on their faces was mirrored by my own anxiety. The situation had escalated beyond a manageable problem. The lessons of months of preparation now manifested in real time. Consequences: nature, left unchecked, respected no HOA rule, no bureaucratic authorization, no paperwork. Time became fragmented, a sequence of rapid, chaotic images. Water tearing at fences, debris swirling, neighbors attempting futile rescues, and me moving among it all, trying desperately to mitigate what had been unleashed. Every failure, every piece of furniture swept away, every patch of mud streaked. Lawn was a stark testament to the necessity of the barrier I had built and the folly of its removal. This was the moment when theory collided with reality, and the cost of pride and rigidity became undeniable. Chaos had reached a personal level. The little girl, Daniel's daughter, was wailing, her small arms clinging desperately to me as I waded through the rising water. Each step was treacherous, mud sucking at my boots, water pulling unpredictably at my balance. I could hear Daniel calling behind me, his voice frantic but steady, trying to coordinate with neighbors, trying to make sense of the unfolding disaster. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic, yet every element was terrifyingly real. The water was no longer a trickle. It was a river of mud, carrying loose debris and uprooted garden ornaments, like a conveyor belt of destruction. Each second brought new challenges, branches snagging my jacket, uneven ground threatening to pitch me into deeper water. The child's sobs were loud, panicked, and piercing. Yet her small grip on my neck conveyed trust. I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, the kind that leaves no room for hesitation. Daniel was right behind us, helping me guide her to safety, shouting encouragement and warnings, pointing out obstacles as we moved. Neighbors were everywhere, some assisting, others frozen with shock. But a few had formed impromptu rescue chains, carrying children and pets to higher ground. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. Had I not built the dam, the scale of destruction would have been exponentially worse, and countless families might have faced far graver danger. Every step we took was a negotiation with gravity, water, and time. I tried to anticipate the flow, to choose a path that minimized risk while maximizing speed. The rain hammered us relentlessly, turning vision into a blur of motion and color. Adrenaline surged through my veins, keeping fear at bay, allowing me to act with purpose despite the chaos around. Finally, we reached a slightly elevated patch of land, just high enough for a momentary reprieve. The little girl clung to me for a heartbeat longer than necessary, eyes wide, breath ragged, and then released in relief when she saw solid, stable ground. Daniel grabbed her hand, ushering her toward his home, thanking me repeatedly. I took a moment to breathe, surveying the devastation around us, realizing that while one life had been secured, the wider neighborhood still faced a catastrophe, and the fight to protect it was far from over. Night had descended over the neighborhood, but the chaos refused to pause with the fading light. The storm had lessened slightly, yet the streets were rivers of mud, carrying debris, furniture, and toppled fences with a relentless current. I moved through the chaos, soaked to the bone, boots squelching in the deep slurry. Each step a precarious negotiation with unstable ground. Every glance revealed another scene of destruction. A neighbor clinging to the hood of a submerged car, another dragging a sofa through waist-high water. The human response was fragmented, disorganized, yet determined. I found myself coordinating rescues almost instinctively, moving from one crisis to another. In one backyard, a mother struggled to carry a small child over a slick, flooded patio. I waded in, offering my arms as a bridge, guiding them to a slightly elevated strip of land. The adrenaline that had fueled my day did not fade with darkness. If anything, the weight of responsibility intensified. I was no longer merely a homeowner defending logic against bureaucratic folly. I was an active participant in crisis management, attempting to preserve life and sanity amid destruction. The streetlights flickered in the storm-laden night, casting elongated shadows that made every piece of floating debris appear more menacing. I shouted instructions, tried to organize helpers, but the reality was relentless. The water flowed according to physics, not persuasion. Every second brought fresh challenges: a child slipping, a fence panel threatening to collapse, water threatening to cut off access to another home. Despite exhaustion, despair was not an option. Daniel and other neighbors worked alongside me, a makeshift team of determined citizens confronting nature's unleashed fury. The scale of devastation was clear, yet small victories emerged. Each person we moved to safety, each piece of critical property rescued, was a moment of triumph in a night otherwise defined by loss. And through it all, the understanding settled in my mind that this flood, born of negligence and pride, was as preventable as it was catastrophic. The lessons of foresight and action were brutally clear, and I silently vowed that the neighborhood would never again allow bureaucracy to outweigh common sense. In the face of real-world consequences, morning light revealed the full extent of the disaster, casting the neighborhood in stark clarity. Mud-streaked lawns, collapsed fences, and scattered debris testified to the violence of the storm and the vulnerability created by the absence of the dam. County investigators arrived in official vehicles, their presence lending gravity to the situation. Cameras clicked, measuring equipment was deployed, and notebooks were filled with meticulous observations. I met them at the edge of my property, pointing to the flattened remnants of the dam, attempting to explain its function, construction, and the consequences of its demolition. The officials listened attentively, nodding as I described how the structure had slowed runoff, redirected water safely, and prevented the flooding of multiple lower yards in previous storms. They took photographs of the channels, noted the displacement of soil and stones, and began taking statements from neighbors. The realization was slowly sinking in. The disaster was not purely a natural occurrence. It had been exacerbated, indeed, caused by the removal of a carefully constructed safety measure. Walking alongside them, I pointed out the path water had taken during the storm, illustrating how the dam had been the critical barrier against complete inundation. The officials paused repeatedly, consulting notes and cross-referencing photos, their faces registering concern and professional surprise. It became clear that this investigation was not routine. The dam's destruction had turned what might have been a standard storm report into a case study in human error and administrative oversight. Neighbors joined in, providing statements and corroborating the function of the dam, each anecdote reinforcing the chain of causality I had outlined. The tension was palpable. I could sense that for the first time, the narrative of unauthorized hazard would be scrutinized under the lens of reality, physics, and responsibility. The HOA president, meanwhile, hovered in the background, attempting to maintain composure. But even his careful posture betrayed worry. For the first time, authority was being held accountable. and the truth was beginning to assert itself in a very visible, undeniable way. The community meeting was held in the clubhouse, yet the atmosphere was anything but composed. Residents packed the room, standing where chairs were unavailable, voices overlapping in a rising cacophony of anger, disbelief, and frustration. Linda Crowford stood behind the podium, her stance defensive, papers clutched tightly, attempting to maintain order, though every attempt was drowned out by the torrent of complaints. The room was warm, tense, and filled with the scent of damp clothing and lingering rain. Voices demanded accountability. "Why did you ignore the warnings?" One resident shouted. "Why did you remove the only thing protecting us?" Another added, pointing toward me as if seeking validation. The room became a whirlwind of motion and emotion, as neighbors leaned in, gesturing toward evidence, waving printed photos of the demolished dam, screenshots of letters, and text messages documenting warnings they had shared. I remained seated for a moment, observing the chaos, aware that my calmness contrasted sharply with the surrounding turmoil. Every word directed at Linda reinforced the narrative. I had tried to communicate for months that the dam had been both necessary and effective, and that its removal had directly precipitated the flooding. Her face reflected strain, eyes darting between the angry residents, the county investigators present, and the stacks of evidence in the room. The meeting grew louder, more impassioned. Neighbors interrupted, shouted over one another, some on the verge of tears, others fists raised in exasperation. It became clear that formalities were irrelevant. The truth, tangible and undeniable, dominated the proceedings. Every resident had a stake in the outcome, and the power dynamics that had governed the HOA for months were dissolving. Under the weight of collective outrage, this wasn't about policy anymore. It was about trust, responsibility, and the stark consequences of decisions made without foresight or expertise. I stood finally, feeling the weight of months of frustration and responsibility condense into a single moment. The room fell into a tense hush as all eyes turned to me. I could see their exhaustion, their lingering anger, and their need for clarity. My voice, steady but firm, began to outline the events, the reasoning behind my actions, and the consequences of the dam's removal. I spoke of runoff, erosion, and the scientific principles that had guided my design, connecting them to the immediate disaster that had unfolded. Residents listened, some nodding, some murmuring agreement, while others simply absorbed the facts with disbelief at the HOA's negligence. Linda's posture shifted. Her hands twitched at her sides, and her eyes avoided direct contact with the growing consensus forming before her. I outlined how warnings had been ignored, how approvals were mismanaged, and how the collective safety of the neighborhood had been jeopardized for the sake of rigid adherence to rules. As I continued, I included evidence, photographs of my barrier during storms, statements from neighbors, and explanations from professionals about its safety and efficacy. Each point landed, reverberating through the room, creating an undeniable narrative of accountability. My calm clarity contrasted sharply with the previous chaos, allowing reason to assert itself amidst the lingering tension. The energy shifted. Residents began to respond, asking questions, seeking guidance, confirming details. The collective outrage was now grounded in fact. The flood's devastation was not just an accident of nature. It was a preventable disaster made real by bureaucracy. I concluded by emphasizing that action, foresight and collaboration, rather than rules enforced blindly, were what ensured community safety. In that moment, the room's focus solidified. The era of unquestioned authority had ended, and the power of truth and evidence had emerged victorious. The removal of the HOA president and key board members was more than symbolic. It was the tangible consequence of months of stubbornness and denial meeting the reality of community and physics. As the nameplate was lifted from the table, a collective exhale moved through the room, the tension dissipating slowly, replaced by a sense of justice being enacted. Linda's figure receded toward the exit, shoulders slumped, face a canvas of frustration, embarrassment, and acceptance. The power she wielded so effortlessly for months had been stripped, replaced by humility and accountability. I observed quietly, recognizing that this was not a moment of personal triumph, but a necessary restoration of balance. Residents murmured among themselves, exchanging nods, recounting the ordeal, and beginning the process of collectively envisioning a safer, better managed future. The room was a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The air cleared of deceit and neglect, replaced with acknowledgement of what had truly been at stake. The fallen leaders had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and resilience of the community they were meant to serve. The consequences were public, undeniable, and irreversible. As the room began to settle, I realized that the victory wasn't merely in the removal of individuals, but in the reestablishment of reason, foresight, and community-driven problem-solving. The neighborhood had reclaimed its voice, its safety, and its future. The morning after the leadership change, a renewed sense of unity spread through the neighborhood. Residents moved with purpose, clearing debris, salvaging possessions, and repairing what had been damaged by the storm. Conversations replaced complaints, laughter punctuated labor, and cooperation became the primary rhythm of the streets. I worked alongside Daniel, lifting boards, moving furniture, and assessing what could be restored. There was no lingering resentment toward one another. The focus was on rebuilding and ensuring that the past mistakes would not define future actions. Neighbors organized themselves into groups, each responsible for specific areas, sharing tools, distributing refreshments, and checking on those who were most affected. The sunlight illuminated faces marked with fatigue but also with determination. Children, who had been scared and displaced the previous night, now played cautiously in safe zones, their laughter a reassuring soundtrack to the cleanup. Through the hard work, a new culture of engagement emerged. Decisions were discussed collaboratively, expertise and advice were valued over hierarchy, and respect for the land, its risks, and its engineering became central to communal action. I moved from group to group, offering guidance when needed, listening to stories, and quietly noting the growth that had occurred. This was more than restoration of property. It was the restoration of trust, empowerment, and shared responsibility. Each cleared yard, each repaired fence, each salvaged personal belonging was a step toward reclaiming not just homes but community identity. The storm had left its mark, but so had our resilience and hope, once fragile, now flourished openly among neighbors who had learned that together, proactive measures and collaboration could overcome even the most devastating challenges. The next phase of restoration involved the construction of a larger, professionally engineered retention dam. County-approved materials were used, blueprints were meticulously followed, and a team of skilled construction workers coordinated their efforts under the watchful eye of engineers and myself. I oversaw the project calmly, knowing that months of experience, observation, and community collaboration had prepared me to guide this process efficiently and safely. Every stone, beam, and trench was aligned to ensure maximum stability and controlled water flow. The worksite was a hive of activity, machines buzzing, workers communicating clearly, and safety protocols observed rigorously. I moved along the length of the construction, checking progress, consulting with engineers, and verifying measurements. This wasn't simply about recreating what had been destroyed. It was about reinforcing the landscape, guaranteeing that the neighborhood would be safeguarded from future storms, and restoring the confidence of residents who had suffered both materially and emotionally. Neighbors watched, some assisting with minor tasks, others observing with gratitude. The presence of the professional team lent reassurance that no further administrative error could compromise the dam's integrity. The project was a tangible manifestation of lessons learned, the integration of expertise, oversight, and community engagement into a single protective structure. As the work progressed, the sense of hope grew. The dam rose steadily, each layer a testament to foresight, collaboration, and resilience. I reflected on how a simple act of responsible construction had cascaded into a neighborhood-wide understanding of accountability and the importance of evidence-based decisions. By the time the structure neared completion, it was clear the neighborhood would never again face such vulnerability, and the collaboration born from crisis had redefined what it meant to be a community. Finally, the new retention dam stood completed, a perfect blend of engineering, foresight, and natural aesthetics. Reinforced concrete ensured durability, while careful shaping and landscaping integrated it seamlessly into the slope, allowing controlled water flow without compromising the environment. Standing with my arms folded, I surveyed the structure, feeling a quiet satisfaction that came not from triumph over an adversary, but from having contributed to the tangible safety and well-being of an entire community. The water, now calm and controlled, reflected the sunlight in a dazzling display, a stark contrast to the chaos of previous storms. I walked along the dam's edge, inspecting each curve, channel, and embankment, knowing that each detail had been carefully considered to prevent future flooding. The work of the professionals had been impeccable, and the lessons learned through months of confrontation and disaster had been invaluable. Neighbors gathered nearby, expressing gratitude, curiosity, and relief. Children played safely along the borders, their laughter echoing as a reminder of the lives protected by both the construction and the decisions that had finally aligned with logic and care. Conversations were filled with shared pride and reflection, acknowledging how collective action, accountability, and collaboration had turned a near catastrophe into a story of resilience. In this moment, the neighborhood felt restored, not just structurally, but socially and emotionally. The dam symbolized more than safety. It embodied the importance of preparation, responsibility, and listening to those who acted in the interest of common good. I understood that this structure would serve as a lasting reminder of the cost of pride and bureaucracy, the value of evidence, and the power of community working together. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across the restored neighborhood, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The chaos, the confrontation, the storms, both literal and metaphorical, were behind us, leaving a quiet sense of completion. I looked at the streets, the homes, the gardens, all meticulously restored, and I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from witnessing resilience in its purest form. Each yard repaired, each structure reinforced, each neighbor standing safe and united told a story of collective perseverance. I thought back to the first threats, the fines, the demolition, and the flood. Every moment of struggle had contributed to this closure. Lessons had been learned, not just by me, but by the community, by the HOA, and by everyone involved. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of passive observation and blind adherence to rules into an active, engaged, and vigilant community. Trust had been rebuilt, not in authority for authority's sake, but in responsibility, knowledge, and shared purpose. The light of the setting sun reflected off the water gently flowing through. The new dam, a mirror of serenity that had once seemed impossible. Children played, neighbors conversed, and life returned to a rhythm shaped by experience.